Thank you. I want to thank Dave and Nancy. They've done a lot of work here today. They're hard people to say no to, so a lot of people are here because of that, I think. But I wanted to talk about the spill and really explain why the lessons we learned during the spill are still relevant today. And the spill, as we discussed, was one of the worst in U.S. history, maybe still the worst. And that was because it happened in an incredible place at a really important time. It was a spring, as Bob was talking about, there were juvenile salmon, herring were spawning, migratory birds were coming into the area, so there was so much potential damage because of it. And then that is why I think it was as damaging as it was. It affected people's lives, tourism, fisheries, native people who lived on the ocean. One of the things I remember the most is native people saying, when the tide is out, the table is set. Well, the table was set with oil, and that was not very healthy for the people who actually lived that way of life, as you can imagine. So we went through all the species. I know Bob wouldn't say how many killer whales died, but according to the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council, it was 22 whales. I've never heard his theory about bullet shots, but it's an interesting one. But I do think that the AB pod never came back, and there are other species that haven't, and there's never been herring fishing again in Prince William Sound. And herring are a very important species, as many of you know, because of the value they are as forage fish at the base of the ecosystem. Everyone has the same pictures, I noticed, but there weren't quite as many. Nowadays, if you have a spill, there are so many photos and pictures, and it was a lot harder. We didn't have cell phones back at that time. We didn't have our little, cameras with us at every second. So, but I wanted to share, too, about Prince William Sound, because I think it's an incredible place. Anywhere else in the country, it would be a national park. I had to put this picture in for Ed Page with the kayakers. But this is an incredible, beautiful place, wildlife galore. I've spent a lot of hours in kayaks in Prince William Sound. It's one of the most serene and peaceful places you can ever go. Glaciers are calving. This is where we get our Copper River salmon, and it was a devastating place. It was hard to fathom how this could happen in such an incredible place. You've all seen this. This is sort of the spill extent in the first, basically, 58 days, 60 days. 2 months. I think what is a good image is that spill was like from the tip of Cape Cod to North Carolina on the East Coast, if it was juxtaposed. I know I have a lot to say. Okay, so I know we don't have a ton of time, but I want to get in some of these points. When the spill happened, I was a legislative aide, 5 years out of college, working for the Alaska State Legislature. It was absolutely devastating to me. I was an environmentalist. I really cared about the environment, but I had no idea that this spill, I think like Ed said, would change the trajectory of my career. And I ended up working in oil spills and dealing with them until this day, and I still do, as many of you in the audience do that worked on the Exxon Valdez. One of the things that is vivid in my memory, and Larry Dietrich talked about this, was, we were sitting in the legislature in Juneau, which is quite a distance from Valdez and Prince William Sound, and we would be asking the legislative staff, the legislators, the governor, would be asking, is there equipment? Is there cleanup? Is anything happening? And basically the answer would be virtually nothing, and this went on for days and weeks. So I think that was a very devastating part of the spill that we really weren't ready. But it was a different time. At the time, in the legislature in Alaska, which is a very red state, as you all know, everyone came together, wanted to clean up, wanted to figure out how we could prevent something like this from ever happening again. Republicans, Democrats, it didn't matter. They were all together. And they, there were some debates, and some were more pro-oil and some were more anti-oil, but really there was a very strong commitment to making sure something like this didn't happen again. The governor, appointed an oil spill commission, and I went to work for that commission at the time. And I think that a lot of the things that were recommended were actually implemented. State laws, federal laws, but unlike the Deepwater Horizon, we were able to get the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 passed. We were able to get these laws passed. No laws were passed after the Deepwater Horizon. So as part of this investigation, this was kind of about a year-long investigation. As part of the investigation, we learned at the time that fishermen and conservationists, since the opening of the terminal, had raised concerns about a spill and said, we're worried there will be a spill. But everyone said, well, and industry said, the chances of a spill are infinitesimally small. And that's kind of what we hear today, even still. And I'm here to tell you, in my life, in my 30 years of working, spills happen. They happen, and big spills happen. And I don't like to call them black swan events, because they're not necessarily black swan. They actually do happen, and they have huge impacts. And we've got to deal with that. So anyway, what did the Spill Commission say? They had some very good findings. They said that this was a failure of a system. It wasn't a drunken captain. It wasn't a automatic pilot not listening to it, but it was really a failure of a system. And the willingness to invest in the spill prevention and the spill response and the capabilities necessary. It was complacency had set in. Not only were regulators complacent, but industry was complacent, and citizens were complacent. Boom was covered in snow. No one thought there was going to be a spill. The equipment was covered. It wasn't available. It wasn't even there. So those were the kind of the findings of the Spill Commission report. And then, as Larry mentioned, there were 59 recommendations of the report. And I'm going to go through a few of them that I think are still relevant today. Many of them, as I said, were implemented in state and federal law, but some of them are still not implemented. So prevention is the most important investment. Citizens must be involved in the oversight. We need strong, fully funded, alert regulatory agencies to implement stringent regulatory standards. Incentives need to be in place to require best available technology. We need surprise inspections and drills. Lots of times government shows up and they've told industry, we're going to be coming to visit you and you can show us what you have in place. And that is not necessarily a way to set up readiness. So some of the more visionary, and all of the things we talked about, the incident command system, oil spill, oops, sorry. Uh-oh, we're all out of luck. The incident command system, but some of the more visionary, and I took this picture, I have to say, in honor of Walt Parker, who was the chair of the Oil Spill Commission at the time, and he just died this year, like Dave said. We lost a lot of strong. Stan Stevens, another great advocate who was a boat captain, a tour guide in Prince William Sound, people who fought for many years on these issues. But I took this picture at his funeral because he had this out at the event. And he was a real visionary. He really thought about other recommendations like systematic safety protections for the Arctic at the time. Oil tankers need to be 100, or other barges, fuel barges, non-tank vessels, 100 miles offshore when they're traveling. Contingency planning needs to be local, regional, and national. You know, there were many very visionary kinds of recommendations that had to do with vessel traffic, but also oil drilling at the time. I'm not going to go through all these, except for I think a couple of them are really important. Having the equipment, I think Robert said, having the equipment and having it practiced and having trained personnel in the region. So you don't have to fly it in. We always talk about cascading in oil spill equipment. Well, in Alaska and then in the Arctic, that is not something that's an easy thing to do. Let's see, there's a couple other ones I wanted to mention. The need for a planning standard that Larry Dietrich mentioned. If you don't require a certain amount of equipment and capability that you can show you can clean up a certain amount of a certain size of a spill in a certain period of time, and you have the equipment to do that, you know, you're just talking about response capability, but you're not talking about actually being able to do what you say you can do. Let's see, any other big ones that I would like to just pull out, given our time frame. One thing that really stuck in my mind as a young person listening to all the hearings that we held with the commission was that industry said, you know, we are only going to do what we're required to do, and by law and by regulation, because otherwise it's economically, it's a disadvantage for us. And I think it's very rare when industry does go above and beyond what the minimal regulations are. And I will say that has happened with Shell in the Arctic. They have gone beyond it, and I've thought about that for a while because they had the backup blowout preventers and they had a couple other things. And I've thought about it, and I think that only happens in the case when government regulations aren't really meeting the needs and aren't strong enough for what is about to take place. So industry actually stepped in and said, you know, we need a few more protections. Let's see. So we put all these things in place, we've learned all these lessons, and then what happens? Deepwater Horizon, and I thought to myself, I thought we took care of all of this. What happened? Didn't we learn anything from the Exxon Valdez? And what I realized is that we applied those lessons and we really improved the situation in Prince William Sound. But what we didn't do is apply it elsewhere. We have the best response capability. We have world-class tractor tugs. We have escort vessels. We have equipment. We have trained fishermen, Vessel of Opportunity Program. We got the Regional Citizens Advisory Council, which is a critical piece of combating complacency. And they've made a huge difference on many fronts to make sure that the industry stays vigilant and they keep doing what needs to be done in Prince William Sound. But those lessons weren't applied in offshore drilling. They weren't applied in the Gulf. They're not being applied now in, I guess my battery's out. So is that the end of my talk? Yeah. It's just getting good. They weren't applied, they're not fully being applied in the Arctic Ocean, and they're not being applied. We're starting to have some of it being applied in the Bering Sea, where tanker traffic is going through, and Ed talked about that, but we still have a long way to go with these, with the kinds of regulatory oversight and prevention that we need.
So we have a few questions lined up here. I think you're all aware that as we have listened today to all of these presentations, we've been taking a lot of notes, which will be applied when we get to the end of these sessions. I have a whole page of topics here just from listening to all of you. A number of the questions that we have, and what's happened is, however, the questions are now on a screen in front of me. A number of these questions are very specific to an individual, like There's a question or two for Larry, there's one or two for Robert. I want to start more generically, and then we'll see if we have time. My thought would be, in that we are limited, if we run out of time, you guys ought to corner these individuals and ask the specific questions. One about how did we ever reconcile the science from two approaches. Larry, one about fishing and what you're doing in terms of human health and monitoring, biomonitoring, and so on and so forth. But one here that I think is more generic and maybe the whole panel can address is thoughts of the panel on increasing tools in the toolbox. Why are we still limited to traditional response techniques? That's a little bit of a loaded question, but on the other hand, I get asked that a lot, and I say, you know, there's still kind of basic skimmer, fire boom. We really haven't kind of got that silver bullet going. So how about the audience talking about that a little bit? Why are we still kind of stuck with the same stuff? And you press that red button, which I haven't been doing a very good job at the top. Ed, go ahead.
Else wants it? I don't really want it, but I'll just can't resist a microphone. No, actually, I think I still bring up the analogy of forest fires. We've been doing forest fires for many, many years. It's nothing new. Technology really hasn't changed. Sometimes you just have to realize there isn't a silver bullet. There really isn't, and because these things grow logarithmically, and it's just a matter, you can't put a boom, you can't get a boom deployed to capture the stuff because it keeps on growing and growing and growing. In some conditions, in the wind conditions, the current conditions, the boom's not going to do the trick. So even though I think most of us have been in the spill response business, I constantly get contacting people that feel they have the technology going to save the day, and it's crazy some of the stuff that comes up with. And they're looked at, and they're examined, they're explored, revisited, but there really is no easy, quick answer, other than the fact that some advances in some of the technology have been used in most recent spills, which is in the horizon spills, dispersants and in-situ burning, are some of the newer technologies that can be applied that can have some substantial impacts when the traditional tools of skimmers and booms aren't really going to do the trick.
Larry?
Here now. Okay, in terms of the technology, the in-situ burning has been unequivocally demonstrated in the Deepwater horizon. I actually believe it worked. It's a good tool, and it works under the right circumstances. But it takes resources. The same thing with dispersants. Dispersants, I think, was 1.8 million gallons dispersed, maybe 364,000 barrels in the Deepwater horizon. The submerged dispersant had the energy, which did not exist in the Exxon Valdez. It didn't. It just laying on the top, and it's not going to work until we got that energy. The dispersant wasn't a good tool. But in the right situation, and if it's properly supported, I think these tools can work. And I think we've had two demonstrations of two of the tools in the Deepwater that show, without doubt, that they're very effective. On the mechanical, I haven't been to a spill yet, personally myself, where I think the mechanical has been run right. Okay, you've got changing oil conditions, you've got different skimmer types, and it has to be supported on the water. With the trained personnel and equipment, you've got to have aerial spotting full time, you've got to get them in the oil, you've got to be going the right speed. You need to be using current buster technologies now, which is all we use in Prince William Sound anymore, to accommodate for the currents and the wind speeds. And you have the resources and the lightering systems. And they didn't exist for the Exxon Valdez. There was one problem after another. But if it was given a real chance, and if it was fully supported and you had it, I would say now, with the equipment we got for mechanical in Prince William Sound, if the same event occurred right now, there are people that are saying the mechanical would have captured 80% or more of that. And I truly believe that. These are mega systems. They're two Transrex systems, high volume, open ocean systems with heavy seagoing boom. It's the kind of stuff you need for the right situation. But if you don't staff it and support it and manage it as a whole system, and if there's one piece goes or the boom connector don't work, you're down. If your storage fills up, you're dead in the water. And mechanical recovery is, to me, is never supported fully to really be able to know that it can perform the way it really, I think, can.
Good. Bob?
I'd like to say a few more words about bioremediation. That was a new technology developed during the Valdez spill. And initially there was a fair amount of resistance because it was unknown. We were applying it during a spill. We didn't have the luxury of testing beforehand. It had been used on a smaller scale on a previous spill. It might have been one of the European spills. But, you know, we were able to get the testing done in Alaska, worked with the EPA, and had conclusive test results. And then once it was approved, it turned out to be very effective for certain types of shorelines. And in the end, we treated over 70 miles of shoreline with fertilizers. So that's a pretty wide-scale application.
Okay, I think we're going to, you have anything, Robert, you wanted to add to that?
Actually, as a complete outsider in response, my understanding of the effectiveness of dispersants is that when they're really working, you'll see a white cloud of material coming off the slick. And what I worry about as an outsider and as a biologist who studies effects is that there's a lot of dispersants put on spills where I don't see that sort of thing happening. And then it's claimed that we have these dispersants and maybe they work during the spill. And I always have questions as to how effective they really were.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to another one. I've got a little bit of a theme going here. Questions goes, numerous speakers have stated that Exxon Valdez could not happen today due to advances in ship monitoring and increased U.S. Coast Guard and pilot requirements. Since most accidents happen due to unforeseen circumstances or unlikely chain of events, it sounds like complacency may be setting in with respect to tanker incidents. Does the panel really think that Exxon Valdez type event cannot happen today? My answer is I don't think that. I think it could happen easily, but I'll turn it over to the panel.
Marilyn's got it. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know, can you hear me? I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, one of the response vessels hit a rock, or
Right.
I can't remember, but
Yeah.
no, it could happen today. Are we more prepared? Yes. Do we have double hull tankers? Yes. Do we have prevention measures? Do we have, are the chances much, much, much smaller? Yes. Now they are infinitesimally small in Prince William Sound. But if it did happen, I think we would be in a lot better shape, and it would be both on the prevention side and on the response side. But yes, it could happen.
And I would agree with that. There was a tugboat. Somebody on? Tugboat. There's a tugboat that actually ran aground in Bly Reef, ironically. They're supposed to be escorting the tanker. It was coming back to port. That's what you're referring to. It's a small spill, though, but, what we've done is the same thing we do when you get in automobiles, you ABS brakes and airbags and seat belts and maintain a speed limit. We dramatically reduce the number of incidents and the potential for those incidents, but they can still happen. I remember when I was captain of the port of Los Angeles Long Beach for 3 years and head of marine safety, and that's a very busy port, very active port, and ships are constantly going back and forth all the time. The only time I had to worry about oil spills when I was kayaking was after a rainstorm because of the storm runoff from cars. So the track record is phenomenal. They bring these huge tankers, these small openings, but there are going to be accidents. The opportunity for accidents can reduce substantially, be less of them, and I think we're better prepared than we've ever been to mitigate the impacts, but they will happen. So I think the trick is to keep the vigilance. And I think in particularly what happens, and I think it's happened in the past, is that as the agencies respond to wherever the wind is blowing, I think the Coast Guard in particular, not that those stones of the Coast Guard, but clearly the focus after 9/11 was protecting our homeland. And the Congress was telling them, your money is going towards protecting us from terrorists. Now, it's still getting money for environmental programs, but the reality is the focus and the emphasis changes based on the winds. And so the challenge is to make sure Congress and the agencies are funded and staffed and whatever to continue the vigilance so that they can minimize the potential of these incidents and also respond better to them.
Dave, can I add one more thing? Can it happen in Prince William Sound? Small. Other places, huge chance. 2012, Shell went up to drill an exploration, a couple exploration wells in the Arctic. On their way home, their tow for the rig lost power, and the drill rig hit aground in Kodiak. It was high winds, high seas, hard conditions in Alaska, but these accidents can happen, and they do happen.
Very briefly, I think as long as human beings are being asked to follow certain regulations and laws, we saw in the case of the Exxon Valdez, they decided not to do that. And so, and I think until we eliminate human error, we're just always going to have the possibility, maybe greatly reduced, but always the possibility for these things to happen again.
We're down to about 4 or 5 minutes. There's 2 or 3, what's that?
Microphone.
I thought I was supposed to have somebody kind of handling me, so why aren't they up here punching the microphone for me? I don't get that. One other, a little bit different take, but I think really interesting and important. It says, how important do you think the role of proactive relationship building with external community partners in general? That's been discussed somewhat around the table, but how important do you all think that is as we think about where we need to go with response and everybody's education? Marilyn, you take that.
Do you mean citizens and external out of the industry and government, or?
Right.
Okay.
I think the affected parties beyond the community that does the response.
Well, I think a really good example of an excellent part of the response capability in Prince William Sound is the Vessel of Opportunity program, where fishermen who know the water, they're as knowledgeable as anyone about Prince William Sound because they spend all their time out there. They are trained, paid to be available, ready to go, trained every year, so that when a spill happens, they can respond, and they have, instead of no skimming vessels and no capabilities, they're ready with that capability, and they know where they're supposed to go, and they know there's communications, and it's all well trained. So, and that's one of the, I think, of the offshoots of the Regional Citizens Advisory Council, which I think still, and I mentioned this already, but I know it has its detractors, but it is a fully funded, it was part of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, is mayors, affected mayors, oil spill mayors, and others who sit on that. And they have about $2 million a year last time I checked in Prince William Sound. So a good budget to actually do research, and they actually jointly conduct research with industry about areas they'd like to see improvements. And it's been very effective. They were effective in getting the high-powered tractor tugs that escort those vessels in Prince William Sound. So I think that's a critical piece. And I know that there was others after the Deepwater Horizon who tried to get something similar in the Gulf, but they haven't yet obtained that.
Yeah, I'll add to what I said earlier. In the course of a spill, when you're really in the throes of it, you have to have communications with the affected communities. I was the liaison with the Cordova Fishermen United, and I remember my first trip to Cordova, walking into the lion's den and getting peppered with questions and hostile, a lot of hostile questions, but it was essential. So we established a dialogue, and as time went on, we had a relationship, and the fishermen weren't happy with us, but we did the best we could to meet their requirements and to try to mitigate the impact on their communities. And we did that throughout the spill. I mentioned the native communities. Chenega was one of the villages that was affected. We hired a lot of the natives from the cleanup. And again, we had people there. We monitored the water and their resources. We talked about setting the table for the natives. Well, they relied on shellfish and critters in the intertidal zone. And we did as much as we could to help them understand where it was safe and where it wasn't safe to harvest seafood. So relationship with the affected communities is absolutely essential.
Thanks. There's several questions here about where dispersants should or should not be used. Why was there controversy around hot water, high pressure washing, a variety of kind of very specific cleanup questions. Where is Nancy? I've lost her. Is she in here? Oh, do I have one more? Can I have one more? So one that's a loaded one, but we've talked a lot about the Oil Pollution Act that came out of Exxon, and it came out quickly after years of sitting around. A lot of discussion about now Deepwater and why no legislation came about. Any thoughts from the panel on whether more legislation is needed? And if so, what the chances might be of that happening? There's a loaded one. Anybody want to talk to that one? Marilyn, why don't you?
I do.
Okay.
Well, I worked for a year to try to get legislation. Pew had a campaign to try to get legislation passed after the Deepwater Horizon, and we got very close, but we were unable to get the bill over the finish line. There were many good, policies in that bill, or in the two separate bills that we had. But like I said, it's a tough time to get these kinds of policies passed. We don't have a Congress that's very amenable to solutions, particularly environmental solutions.
Ed? And then Larry.
Okay.
What's your button?
Actually, I really don't have much to offer on that because I wasn't familiar with the Macondo spill and I don't know all the issues, so I'm just going to pass on that one.
Okay.
It's not my forte.
Yeah, I think that we had, in the Exxon Valdez, the state required a contingency plan. And it theoretically had a 200,000 barrel scenario that drove the equipment, trained personnel, and response resources that they would have in place to deal with a 200,000 barrel spill. And it turned out not to be so by orders of magnitude. You probably recall the plan was referred to as the greatest piece of maritime fiction since Moby Dick, was one of the quotes. So there's a gap. There's a fairly serious gap between what's represented in a contingency plan, what's put in it to meet a theoretical standard. The change the state made was we didn't have a defined standard, and therefore the equipment wasn't there. So, but it did meet the regulation, okay? So there's a problem here. If you look at Macondo, if I recall, maybe some of you can correct me, it had a 250,000 barrel scenario in the BP plan. The BP plan, I believe, had a 490,000 barrel a day recovery capacity. It was a 60,000 barrel a day blowout. So if you've got a 490,000 barrel a day capability in your plan, you're dealing with a 60,000 barrel a day blowout, what's the problem here? Well, that's a fairly serious gap. And I think that's one of trust with the public, and why the public, when you say contingency plan, they say, oh yeah. And that, I think, is a serious problem today yet that needs to be resolved. Now, whether that would require legislation or could be done by rulemaking, I'm not sure, but there needs, if a plan says you got 100,000 barrel a day capability, then you ought to be able to come pretty close to that. It's not like we're missing when the spill occurs, if you got 100,000 barrels that you only got 90. It's like the recovery was 3%. And so the gap here is huge. I think it's a tremendous public trust issue. I think the public sees through those things, and that is something I think that should be addressed.
Okay. I think we will wrap it up, Nancy, unless a number of other good questions here. Like I said, be sure and buttonhole these panelists. That's part of what we hope, is that there'll be dialogue offline, and some of the questions are very specific to the individuals. So please take it up with them, and thank you all very much for your patience with us today.